You mentioned informed consent, because there's really not one when it comes to vaccines. And so we're in the context of forced vaccines. So the question is, am I going to be forced to vaccinate? Well, there's a real problem with that when there's no informed consent, because you mentioned there's not one. So how is that possible that there's no informed consent for something that realistically has the potential to do some harm?
Right. And that's the travesty of looking back and not appreciating history repeating itself, because, you know, some people know what the Nuremberg trials meant after World War II, where we brought these people to trial and said, never again will we experiment on the human population without informed consent, full informed consent without coercion, right? When you have something that is mandated in order to attend school, and the common consensus and belief is that you have to do this to get your child its free education, or his or her free education, how is that not coercion? You know, even that acceptance of a mandated medical protocol, of a population-wide medical protocol, strips humans of true informed consent. And now the CDC even says on its website that, you know, informed consent is not required for vaccination. It's dependent upon the cities, the states, to provide that protection. However, we all look to the CDC as primary guidance. So we've seen this slippery slope coming about for, since vaccines received immunity from liability. So since the 1986 Act was signed into law, we've had a huge issue with informed consent. These mothers who experience devastating injury within their family, they wouldn't have chosen the intervention if they would have been given informed consent.
So will this be a forced vaccine, or will I be forced to vaccinate? You know what's really interesting about this? You mentioned the word coercion. And you and I know medical doctors who give informed consent to the parents before they do or do not vaccinate. And those medical doctors are risking losing their livelihood, losing their license because of given that informed consent. And you know the word that they are using is that these medical doctors are coercing their patients not to vaccinate.
Just because of making the decision theirs. And it is such a fallacy that anyone is in a better position to make health decisions for you and your children. And we have to wholeheartedly reject that bodily autonomy is up for grabs, because no one will be left holding the cards emotionally, financially, physically when the wrong drug at the wrong time or the right drug at the right time causes damage or permanent damage or death in a given family. And so we have to reject that there is anyone else, including the government, that can make healthcare decisions for us. And what people need to know right now is, in the current state, we're already in a landscape where parents have to be empowered to take informed consent because it will not be given as it relates to the vaccine program, especially as we're looking at this pandemic where it could be issued under an emergency provision.
You know what really bothers me is the word collateral damage when talking about a child who was injured from a vaccine for the greater good.
Right.
Because that's the argument to what you just said. You know that is that, yes, there will be some, but that's just the collateral damage to protect the whole. And if you just consider that medical doctors are risking losing their license by giving informed consent, and that there will be a child, not just a child, there will be many children. In fact, you probably have the numbers. Like how many, if you vaccinated how many of those children would then be what we'd call collateral damage? And who's willing to accept that for their child individually? And then looking at the whole, it's actually more than what's at this point attributable to the COVID death count would be the collateral damage for forced vaccinations.
And those studies aren't done to show, is the mortality rate better with or without? Those studies, they simply aren't done because there are not long-term studies. Therefore, you can't show that morbidity, mortality is better with the intervention than without. And I know that that's a big word, but basically it means that if you do receive an intervention, in that population, do we have lower disease rates and lower death rates.
But wait. COVID is the only one with no long-term studies, right? The COVID vaccine, correct?
Absolutely not.
It's
Hep
incredible.
B was studied for 5 days.
How's that possible? Is that true?
Yeah.
Is that fake news, what you just said right there?
No, you can look on the vaccine insert and look at these studies that were done in order to get the licensure. So in order to get the FDA approval,
5 days.
was actively studied for 5 days. So, in studies, they parse it out through, okay, we're going to monitor you for 5 days. We're going to collect this information. And then other than that, it becomes voluntary to report back and say what happened or to collect information based on the population that did or did not receive the vaccine.
And Hep B, come on, we're talking about dirty needles at that point, or like sexually transmitted. Am I right?
Right. Sexually transmitted disease and dirty needles, or passed down from the mother.
5 days, and yet that's on the child. Is that not on the childhood schedule?
Day 1 of life.
And why is it on day 1 of life?
Well,
because think about it. I mean, is that child going to share dirty needles with a heroin addict, or have a sexually transmitted, a sexual encounter with a prostitute at day 1 of life? Of course not. So why is it at day 1?
We've heard nurses say that, when your child learns to walk, they could step on a dirty needle. Well, okay, that's not for a year, A, and B, that's such a remote risk. Once again, it goes back to the risks and benefits. In some industrialized nations, very few justify day 1 of life because of maternal rates of Hep B, but those are only in nations that have really high incidence of Hep B in females, whereas most countries say that if the mother is Hep B positive, then they recommend the Hep B vaccination. We don't even take that step here in the U.S. It's just across the board, a universal recommendation that many people have to fight in order to claim an exemption because of the pressure from nursing staff and hospitals.
So clearly, it just doesn't make sense. So clearly that makes absolutely no sense. Yet here we have what we would say mandatory vaccines in order to attend school, yet you can still religiously, and in some cases fundamentally or philosophically opt out, right? This payment in kind thing, how do we get around this in your mind? How do we get around the payment in kind thing? Because I think that's what most people are worried about. That's what I'm worried about. How am I going to fly? Am I ever going to go to Spain? Like, I want to go to Spain. I want to visit Europe. Like, do I have to do that before, January, whatever of 2021? Like, what?
Well, there are a few things that we need to resist, and they have to be resisted on a massive level. Public pressure must be created against 2 things. 1 is 24/7 surveillance, and 2 are the medical mandates. So 24/7 surveillance is used as a tool to enforce any mandate they create. And if we have that, if we have this ID 2020 come to fruition and everyone opts into ID 2020, then that is the mechanism by which they can enforce payment in kind. And just recognizing that if you look back through history, how have dictators accomplished their rule? And it's through constant fear and constant surveillance. People
Is that
think
involved tracking too?
Yes, and people think that it's silly to value your privacy rights, but it's not, because you are the only one that has your pure best interest in mind. And so when we give up information unnecessarily to national, even global databases, how will that be used? You cannot say, because absolute power corrupts absolutely.